Okay, kids, we're going to get started now. We're going to move to our first presenter, Mr. Stan White.
Good afternoon, everybody. Just wanted to, today I want to talk about scenery and show some examples of ways with scenery that we can create perspective and depth and some realism in our layouts. We're going to use Russ Weis's New York Central layout today and as a visual example of some of these principles. So before I get started, I want to give a shout out to two great modelers who've contributed so much to this layout. First of those is Steve Lasher for his beautiful detailing and weathering of structures. Also to Bob Kukler, he provided a bunch of handmade trees for Russ's layout. And of course, Russ himself for providing the canvas, such a great canvas for us all to work on. So it's been a lot of fun working on that layout. So to get started on this first slide, I want to look at a challenge that we have typically in railroads when we have a scene where we have a, let me go right in here and put my cursor on here. We have a scene that goes into the backdrop. Sometimes visually it's very difficult to get that to look realistic. We can go straight in, and from one perspective it looks pretty good, but if we get off to the sides, it looks kind of weird. There's different techniques. Some people use mirrors in there and then hide the mirrors with trees and that sort of thing. Another great technique is to take the road and have it curve and go around behind a hill or structures, that sort of thing. So the challenge here was when Russ first started this scene, he had it going right into the backdrop, and we're trying to figure out how do we make this transition back here to look realistic. And so the solution was to take this hillside, which he had along the backdrop, and cut into that, slice it across here, and then bring the road around behind there, and then as that runs into the backdrop, hide that with some vertical elements, these trees and bushes and that sort of thing. And that gave that scene a very realistic look. And you'll also notice in this picture, we've added a backdrop, which we didn't have in the first picture. And here you can see as we look across here, there's a couple examples here. Not only have we solved the road issue, but we've also created layers in this scene where every time we create a layer, we push the layer in the back, further back into the scene. So with this, we have the tracks come across. We've got the hillside. We've got a scene here, the road, and then we've got another scenery element here on the other side of the road. And then with the backdrop is painted. Every time we add something to the backdrop, that pushes the scene further back in and gives us a bigger depth of field in the scene. So if you look at this now, the eye comes in and goes right down this valley here. And then also this road wants to take your eye around the curve in the road, which is what we're trying to accomplish here. And this next scene, let's see, was that not changing the way that goes there? That's not changing the way it should. Anyway, in this scene here, we can see the difference between the two, and we can see over on the right hand side. How do I get rid of this? Go up here a minute. Put up here. Okay, in this next scene, we can see this is another example where we started to bring the scene in. We put ground cover in here, and the scene's starting to come alive. But again, it looks real cold because it goes right into the backdrop. And very seldom, unless you're out in Montana, do you see scenery go right into the backdrop. There's usually some horizon ground behind the scene. And in this next shot here, I think it's not working. The next shot here, what we've done is that we've added some vertical elements here. Again, we added the backdrop, a painted backdrop behind, which creates depth in the scene. We've added some vertical trees in here of different types to give your eye the appeal of a natural scene. Some evergreens, some low bushes, ground covers in here, which all creates texture. And when we create texture, we also create depth in the picture. And so you can see here, again, comparing the two, the total difference in the view here. It's a much warmer scene. It's a much more realistic scene, and it has a lot more depth to the scene. In this next example, this is a great example of how we can actually take and make your eye go around through a scene here by putting this view block up in here with the trees and some ground cover, and then also this vertical element here with the signals. We force your eye to want to go around this curve and go towards the tunnel. Without that, it doesn't have as much depth as it does when we do this with the vertical elements in here. And that scene kind of comes alive. That's really a good looking scene on Russ's layout. This is another example of lack of depth in the scene. We painted the backdrop on here, as you can see, but it's a very cold scene. Your eye doesn't really go back because we don't have enough layers in here to bring your eye back through the scene. So what we did here was add a bunch of elements in here. We've added the trees in through here, bushes, field, some detail in here, some vertical elements with the windmill, some more trees in through here. And now all of a sudden we have your eyes brought in here, and then you see the track behind it, which creates the layers. And then again, Russ has done a great job on his layout all across here. If you notice, on most of his layout, he's put a berm up between the horizontal element of his layout and the vertical element, which gives you a great transition into the backdrop, and you're not going right into the backdrop. But by doing that and then adding the telephone poles and stuff up here, now you can see in this scene, we've got a good field of depth in this scene. So really has come alive there. Here's a good before and after. You can see a totally different view, a presentation there in that scene with the elements. This next example is this scene's coming along real well. He's got the berm along the side, but in the back here and everything. But again, it just kind of it's really kind of a flat scene. And in this next scene, what we will see is that by adding some of these vertical elements, the trees, the telephone poles, and Russ reworked this the station house. We replaced that and redid that. And he and Steve came in here and detailed both of these structures, the freight house and the depot. Did an excellent job on detailing and weathering that, which adds to the scene as well. And then drop the scene up. And here's a good example in the back. If we look back here, the horizontal part of the scene goes right into the backdrop. And so what Russ did here to block that was to put a fence up along here, which gives you a transition between the horizontal scene and the vertical scene here in the back, which helped out a bunch. And this is just another example of what adding the vertical elements do to a scene with your eye and giving it depth of feel. And then also just notice in here too, by adding curves, if you look in here, by adding curves to the track and the road bed, that also helps you in creating depth and richness in the scene. You can see that here as he brings the road through under the underpass and has it wind around behind the station that direction and then to the right. It's not just straight roads. And this is another good example of that as well. And that scene really pops now with the vertical elements and the layering that's gone into that scene. And then here's another trick you can do too to get depth is as you with these telephone poles. What we did was reduce the height and the distance apart as they go back into the scene, and that gives you a false sense of distance as well. So that helps with your layering in your scenes here. This is a picture of the two, comparing what we've added versus what was there before, and you can see the major difference in how that scene is really warmed up and come to life with the addition of the vertical elements and stuff. This is an example of a scene without any backdrop, and you can see how cold that looks. And the simple way to fix this, Russ got some commercial backdrops and put those up behind the scene, and it really makes that scene pop Now it has some depth of field, really is appealing and brings all the detail in the front part to your eye as well. And there's a good example of before and after with that scene. And then these other next slides are just slides where just showing a use of texture in here creates depth of field too. As we put bushes and ground covers, trees, and you can see how it almost looks like you can go back here and get behind these trees with this layering effect here. And then the scene, it pushes the mountains back here, way back into the scene. Just very simple to do. Here's just another example of layering and different textures. We've got grasses in here and bushes, different types of bushes and trees and ground covers in here to give us that layering. Using, these are cattails. Any kind of different texture we can put in here makes the eye think it's a natural scene. I think this is a ground scatter that Russ put down along with some grasses and that sort of thing. And then in this scene, you see it's just another example of creating layers and depth. And a secret in modeling is when you put trees in, trees typically don't grow by themselves. They usually grow in groups. And for some reason, I don't know but visually odd numbers are good, 3s, 5s, and 7s. So when you plant stuff, do it in groups of 3, 5, 7, and that'll give you a better visual in the scene. In here, I just wanted to show an example of what Russ did here, using a combination of all the elements. We have a painted backdrop. He's overlaid that with a commercial backdrop. And then he's come in front of that and put a fence in and then a low relief building. And you can see the depth of field that this scene is giving you now. So there's all kinds of combination of ways that you can create depth and feel and not have your layout look real narrow, because this is one of the narrowest parts on his layout, and he's really increased the visual distance by doing that with the layering effect here. So that's pretty much all I wanted to show today, was show some of the transitions in Russ's layout. And I hope it's been interesting to you. And if you have any questions, I'll be open to ask questions.
Okay, thanks, Stan. We're gonna unmute everybody and have at the questions.
Well, first of all, I want to say thanks to Stan for doing this. A number of months ago, I kind of wrote, how many people that you'd like to work on your layout. So I've been very fortunate that to have Stan do all his magic, and like he was saying, sometimes two heads are better than one. Before the pandemic, Bob Kukler, as Stan mentioned in the beginning, had come over and started planting the trees. And we were thinking about behind the station there. It was actually Bob's idea to put that fence in, and he said, "What do you think about this?" And I was thinking about maybe a building flat or something else. And he said, "How about if we do this?" And it's like, yeah, that really looks good there. So it's nice to have a bunch of really talented guys come over and work on the layout. And I really appreciate that.
Questions? Anybody else? Questions?
Hey, yeah, Stan, Bob Francron, you gonna come over and help me with mine now?
Oh, sure. You have all the spare time.
I tell you, no, you guys did a great job. I've operated on Russ's layout. I didn't even recognize some of the scenes. So really fantastic job, you and Bob and Steve, whoever else helped Russ. Just fantastic. Can't say enough.
Okay, let's move on to Mr. Barry Christensen. Even though he's labeled Robin, he's actually Barry. I'm sure you all recognize him. You go ahead and share your desktop, Barry, when you're ready.
So this afternoon's topic is a simple one, and really, as much of anything, I'm hoping to fish for information during the Q&A time about how you all do this. but it's just a way over the years that I've collected information about my freight car fleet, and then how I've cataloged a lot of interesting prototype history and details about my freight cars. And the results have been really good. I think a lot of us, myself included, we love the motive power. I remember getting my very first diesel spotter's guide as a kid. I mean, it was the Bible to me. And of course, we all have our favorite passenger trains that we love, and the varnish gets a lot of attention on our layouts. And then there's the freight trains, you know, everyday workaday freight trains. And the same thing is true when we work on construction and scenic detailing. We are very careful about our construction. We certainly like to scenic our layouts really authentically. And then we run these freight trains through our layouts, past the varnish with fabulous motive power. And the freight cars have cast on details, sometimes the same numbers on the various cars. And I get it, you know, I mean, it's really expensive to put a highly detailed freight train together, and it takes a lot of time. But really the dividends are great because freight trains are such a big part of the railroad scene. So really, you know, my hope is that this can help us to take what we've learned from people like Mike Berry, who shares a lot of prototype freight car information with us, Bob Frankrone, who helps us with prototype loads and weathering, and of course, my fellow Santa Fe modeler, Bruce, who's also presenting, who's helped us so much with detailed upgrades on freight cars, whether to just make a few changes in the decoration, or to totally repaint the car, or to throw it in the bin for the next swap meet, or we all make those decisions. So really, it's just a matter of collating the research that's readily available out there for us, sort of like a dossier on each freight car of what it's all about. And then for outcomes for that is it will guide the improvements we make to our freight cars, and it will guide the way that we use the freight cars on our layout. So an example of the first one for that is, I have a photo of an Erie Lackawanna mechanical refrigerator car in my hometown that I took when I was a kid. Well, I found a blue box Athearn model of that Erie Lackawanna mechanical reefer, and I built it. Pad printing was pretty bad on it. Eventually, Athearn did a ready to roll with really nice pad printing, and I bought that and put the other one out for sale. And then eventually Athearn did a Genesis level of that Erie Lackawanna mechanical reefer, which now graces my layout and brings lots of frozen foods to my town. So just a matter of improving over the years and doing the research to discover that. And then on my layout, I've discovered a lot of things that guide my freight cars. For instance, there was one industry in my hometown that actually received Pacific Fruit Express ice reefers, even though it was a Santa Fe rail line through my hometown. Also, we got helium cars in my hometown, and that was for the Santa Ana Naval Base, where they had the old blimp hangars. Also discovered over the years that Railway Express Agency went out of business right about the time of my layout run date, but that their refrigerator cars were bought up by private operators and used. So those are examples of turning the information into prototype operations on the layout. So when I was a kid, I just would take 3x5 cards and I'd make notes in my rail fanning. I'd take a lot of photos and make notes on my photos, and I kept those 3x5 cards in files, which now, of course, 50 years later, they're 3 file boxes jam-packed. And then, of course, during the last 20 years or so, I've used Word documents and Excel files for my information about my freight cars and about the different sources that I use. So examples of sources would include a lot of good prototype freight car books and articles. This would be from model railroading magazines and from Railway Society magazines especially. It would be from Kalmbach with their wonderful series on the various industries along the line, so valuable. The older freight car series that was in the horizontal folio book style, paperback books from about 30 years ago. And then the onslaught of hundreds upon hundreds of Morning Sun books on color guides for freight cars and everything else. I mean, just we live in such a rich era now. And then the internet is the other big bonus nowadays. There's a fellow who went by the nickname Sam, and he has a website. It's hosam.com. He's passed away, but they keep that up, and it's full of freight car prototype details for modelers. George Elwood is a fellow that also has put together a gigantic photograph site for freight cars. Railroad Picture Archives is another. Many of the railway societies have good websites, and a lot of the fans, like Southern Pacific fan Lee Gotro, has a wonderful site. It's railgoat.railfan.com on the Southern Pacific. The railroads themselves left behind lots of operating materials. I use the click books the Santa Fe had that shows every single siding and every single customer. The marketing materials that Santa Fe did about all their freight car fleet with details. And then the industry did the official railway equipment register, the official railway guides, the Jane's publications for world railways and urban railways that you can get at historicrail.com. And then the Railway Prototype Cyclopedia series, that's good if you're modeling up into the 60s era or before the transition era. And the industry series called Car and Locomotive Cyclopedias. Now, the 1974 edition of that, which is the year that I model, was the centennial edition of the Car and Locomotive Cyclopedia, and it is just jam-packed with so much about freight cars from the 60s and 70s, my era there. So as I go through these many, many sources, I'm going to start compiling information. Of course, the reporting mark on my freight car, those do change over the years and they can get reinitialed. What does the reporting mark mean? Some of them have mysterious meanings that I can discover that have to do with how the car is equipped or what it's used for. Then the car number itself, or if it's renumbered after being rebuilt or what have you. The AAR has mechanical designations such as BX for boxcar and what have you. And those are specialized for different types of boxcars, for instance, and every other type. Who built the car, when was it built, and where was it built? These often are listed on the side of the car. Reweigh dates are really important, shows where and when the car was last reweighed, and they stencil it there. And then many railroads like the Santa Fe, Union Pacific, and Southern Pacific that I grew up with, the Pennsylvania and others, they have a car class that they give to each style of car that they will put in the lower right-hand corner. And then each car is part of a series as well, of number series is what I mean there. And then I can learn about the length of the car, the cubic feet of the hopper, the number of gallons in the tank car, the various AAR and DOT tank car information, the specific coloring, like Cascade Green for Burlington Northern, or Indian Red for Santa Fe, the heralds and the logos, which we love so much, and the slogans like Ship and Travel Santa Fe all the way. And then so many stencils on the side of the car that are so informative. Back in the day of journals, they had the repack date. Then later with roller bearings, the lube date was put on. The car sides and the car ends have various stencils related to all different mechanical features. Over the years, they've tried different ID things, such as the ACI barcodes of the 60s and 70s, and the AEI devices today that use RFID technology for ID. When we had the problems with the wheels in the late 70s, they used the wheel dots to indicate if the cars had been retrofitted. Chalk marks, especially in the earlier days up through the transition era. Truss plates, which originally were an actual metal plate and then later a stencil on who owns the car. And then down on the air reservoir, the cleaned, oiled, tested stencil notation for the brake and air mechanics. Information about door hardware, excess height, what plate the dimensions are, such as plate C or above, which has to be labeled. In 1971, they began to consolidate some of that information into a consolidated lube plate, which were those black boxes in the lower right. Those continued on in various smaller forms up until just a couple years ago. And then where the freight car needs to go if it's in an assignment is its return to stencil, where to send it back to. And many other things as well, but this gives you an idea. Now I'm going to take my model in hand and I'm going to look at all these notes that I've made and I'm going to investigate my model. Are the ladders proper? Are there grab irons or short ladders on the left side? What's the brake wheel and brake system like? How about the roof? Is it a bow tie Pullman roof? Is it a diagonal Stanley roof? What are the ends like? Are they dreadnoughts? Are they proprietary like the dispatch ends that the New York Central used from the dispatch shops? How about running boards? In my era, many of them were being removed. Is it a straight sill on the bottom or is it notched or diagonal? Is the flooring wood or steel? Are there loading devices in the car for bracing? Is it outside braced or inside braced? Is it welded or riveted? What type of couplers does it have? Does it have a shelf coupler if it's a more modern car? And trucks, which I find to be the most difficult. It's hard for me to identify a lot of different styles of trucks, but there's lots of good models of different style of trucks. And the cushioning as well, if the car has different cushioning devices. And then does it have the proper wheels? Anywhere from 28 inches to 36 inches, depending on the type of car. So I'm going to check my car out and I'm going to start making changes now based on what I'm learning. And I'm going to keep an index of which box of slides that personal photo is of that Erie Lackawanna mechanical reefer I talked about. Which internet source did I get that great photo or that great piece of information from? What page in the magazine or the book is the information so I can go back and look at it? What year is the equipment register or the encyclopedia that covers my car? So I can have that information now in my dossier. And then we go ahead and make the upgrades, and I keep an Excel file as I make the upgrades so I know the work that still needs to be done, getting those reporting marks and car numbers correct, adding a little weight to my model so it runs better, getting better wheel sets on it if it needs it, gauging it, tuning it with my truck tuner, oiling it if it needs oil in the bearing, getting that coupler height and the correct coupler on there, greasing them, and then making the changes to the hardware, the paint, and all of that. And then finally, operating that car correctly. So the helium car gets to the naval base, the Pacific Fruit Express car gets to the right produce operator, et cetera, et cetera. Now we'll go ahead and open it up for discussion and hoping that you guys will be able to give me lots of good ideas on how you also work with your freight car fleet.
Moving along, our next presenter is going to be Bruce, who's going to give us a little tour of his layout. He'll give after we get the screen transitioned here, he'll give you a short, brief description about what he does with his Santa Fe layout. And then we'll show, it's about a 10-minute long video narrated by Bruce, giving you a tour of his layout. So.
Okay, guys, this is Bruce. I've given you 3 presentations, 2 of them via Zoom and 1 in person, a year and a half ago, about how the cars I build, the projects I work on my railroad. And Ron got in touch with me and said, going along and following up with that, can we show everybody your railroad? And I said, of course. So he came over and brought some good video equipment and put together this video. This is basically a walking tour of around the railroad, and a couple notes before he starts to show it. Railroad was built for me to operate. It's a double track mainline Santa Fe. It's a figure 8 folded back over itself. It doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't do anything. Trains just go round and round. And what I do is I get down there and I work one or both ends of the classification yard while there may be a train or two out running on the main line. I send trains out, I bring trains back in, and I work with the other programs I showed you to build realistic, at least as far as Santa Fe goes, and some of the other railroad equipment I have on there, build realistic cars and acquire realistic cars, kind of piggybacking on what Barry was talking about. I do check things carefully. If it's a Santa Fe item, the Santa Fe Society has been very good. They have a series of rolling stock reference books put together by some of the noted Santa Fe historians and authorities. They cover all the freight cars, cattle cars, open top cars, box cars, tank cars, and all the types of passenger cars, from head-end equipment to coach cars or chair cars, whichever the case may be. Buffet, dining, library, and Pullman type cars, or cars with compartments and bedrooms and stuff in them. And I find those to be super helpful in what I'm doing. And I look at dates too, just like we talked about there. If something came along and was produced in 1968, it won't work for me because my railroad is cut off probably in the late summer or fall of 1967. And when we follow up the walking tour of the railroad, if Ron wants to run any of the videos, he recorded a lot of run-bys of some of my trains running on the railroad. And if you look carefully, and if you remember any of them, you'll see some of the cars and some of the equipment. I've described the process of how I either built it, modified it, or made it correct for what we're looking at on the railroad. And I think time dependent, of course, you guys decide that. If there's any questions, certainly I'll be glad to answer them afterwards.
So we'll go ahead and roll the video now, Bruce. And just a couple of quick notes here. This, as I say, runs about 10 minutes. We'll stop it at the end for any questions about the layout itself before we get into a few run-by videos, what we have time for. If you have any volume issues, just adjust the volume on your own device as this starts to play.
Okay, we're starting viewing the railroad at the east end of the freight classification yard, moving towards the west. One of the things we'll see on the far side of the yard there is my scale and test car facility. That was something I presented to you a couple sessions ago in one other general meeting. Information about some of the projects I've done. Just behind the scale, you'll see a complete line of refrigerator cars, and they are on the dedicated refrigerator car staging track, and it leads to an icing facility. The yard branches out here, 2 tracks down the center considered arrival and departure tracks, and storage tracks for about 250 freight cars. Looking closely, you might see some of the cars I've highlighted in a couple of presentations about my projects. The far side of the yard right now, there's an icing plant and an ice dock to take care of the ice bunker refrigerator cars. You guys can also see this is a real basement. There's my bicycle right indoors. Bottom now is the control panel. This is still a pure straight DC railroad. I've got double track main line labeled east and west because typically that's what they are. They have 4 independent blocks on each one, controllable by the toggle switches. Each end of the yard is individually controlled for power source with those rotary switches, so they can be powered from either end of the cab controls or the mainline power packs. And a little further in the lower left corner of the control panel is the schematic for the engine service facility, which we'll see in a minute. Independently controlled tracks and blocks in there. Looking back up across the yard, or coming up, you can see the front side of a Santa Fe one-story depot, which we'll take another look at on the outside view.
We just pause here for a second, and I'd like to draw your attention to Bruce's awards over here that he's won for some of his freight car work. He has beautiful, beautiful equipment.
And we're approaching the west end of the rail yard next, after the depot. Depot is in a fictional town in New Mexico called Cahoots. So the joke becomes, have you ever been in Cahoots? Now entering from the left is the diesel service facility. We've got 2 fueling and sanding tracks, and you can see the prominent sand reservoirs, and 5 other locomotive storage tracks. And in the background, there's some associated buildings you'd find with most any kind of a yard facility. We might have lost the audio, Ron. I'll just go ahead and narrate from here then. You can see part of the double track main line. I've got operating block signals. Now starts a descent down to the lower level.
How's that sound?
Basic overall track It's plan, back again. Good. It is a figure 8 folded back over itself. So that if you stand in one spot, you'll actually see a train go by twice, once on each level, before it gets back to its starting point. And the near view is what becomes the lower level. That's a downgrade. The one you're looking at in the back is also a downgrade. Or if you're coming the other direction, it's an upgrade. The railroad was designed to be kind of self-sufficient for my purposes. I can operate classification yard, and I can have 1 or 2 trains out running on the main line and pretty much take care of themselves as they make their circuits around. Occasionally I'll switch tracks on them, or send a train out of the classification yard or bring one in, kind of just on a whim of what I feel like doing. Coming into view from the left is the one industry or function on the railroad. It's a mine. I've got some hopper cars staged for loading there now. Every once in a while I switch them out with loaded hopper cars just to change the view. And just to the left of the big mine structure is a little one that I say in the history of the mine was where they started. And then they got bigger and built a newer facility, bigger facility. The rails in the back disappear underneath into a tunnel at this point. And they'll run parallel and underneath the upper level tracks. And here's a crossover that allows switching between main lines or facilitates entrance and exit into the yard from either of the 2 main lines. The terrain represents the desert Southwest, and fictionally, again, it's somewhere in New Mexico, I say, perhaps between Clovis and Beelan, New Mexico. I frankly admit I'm not the greatest senior guy in the world, so I think the path of least resistance here probably. And we're returning where we started, back to the east end of the classification yard. Picking up again, we've switched from the inside of the railroad to the outside. We're at the east end of the classification yard. And we're seeing both the upper, and we see a tunnel exit where the tracks that entered on the backside come out. And after a short run, it enters another tunnel. I'd add for you guys that hidden inside the level running out in the open at this point are some staging tracks. The other side of the tunnel we just entered, on the other side of the stairway, it goes underneath the stairway in the house, passes by a golf course. You can tell by the contrast in the features there, it has to be well irrigated to get that much green out here in the desert. And then just shifting to the upper level again, we can see the other side of the icing facility for the ice bunker refrigerator cars. Moving further to the right, we'll soon see the other side of the one-story depot that sits out here in the middle of nowhere near a town. Follow the road out to get to the town. It's got a semaphore train order signal, a few vehicles. There's some people as if they're waiting for a train. People are on the track side. The upper track, as we geographically move to the west, the lower track once again is going to enter another tunnel, and it will also be under the upper level of the railroad, paralleling it. Overall dimensions for the railroad, it's about 34 feet in its longest dimension and about 18 feet in its widest dimension. But as you can see, it's open in the middle, and that's where I operated from. Coming along to the other side of the engine service facility, and you get a different angle view of it. The locomotives stored there being serviced, the caboose track. And we are at the west end of the rail yard, the classification yard again.
So that's kind of the end of Bruce's layout tour there. As I say, we have a couple of run-by videos here to take a quick look at. We'll go ahead and start this first run-by video here, but feel free to continue with your questions of Bruce. There's no sound really except the engines going by.
Hey, Bruce, Bruce,
An alligator.
Yep,
Yes.
RS-215.
Yeah, an alligator. You don't see many of those.
Same thing, was a big buyer of them. I only have one.
And Bob and guys, you know, that's a real testament to that, say even code 100, that if you paint the rails and the ties and do a good ballast job, you can't tell it's code 100.
Yeah, no, it really really looks nice. Surprised me. That's why, when you said it was code 100, I said, okay, but who made it? Because I didn't think it was Atlas. So yeah, it's very nice.
Yeah, well, like I said, if you do as nice a job as what Bruce did there, like on the ballasting and everything, you can't tell the difference. And the other thing, guys, is that we all, the ones that are in DCC, we all try to, like you just see this lash up going by that to have them speed matched. It's remarkable that Bruce takes an inordinate amount of time to kind of check and pre-run that all of his diesels in the lash up there are pretty well spot on speed match. So it's and I think in the layout tour you saw that some of them he had 4 and 5 on the point there. So it's just an excellent running railroad.
Hey, Bruce, are you using sound on your engines or not?
I don't have any sound in the diesels. I have 2 for nostalgia reasons, 2 steam locomotives. They do have sound. They're from Broadway Limited. And I run those occasionally. They don't fit 1967 at all, but like I said, nostalgia.
Well, sometimes non-sound is good.
Sometimes operating on Russ's Railroad and Rob Cooper, if he's around, they have good sound settings on their equipment. I have been to some railroads where folks have it just jacked up way too high. 30 feet away, you can hear this diesel or steam locomotive, when in reality, you probably wouldn't if it was the real world.
I agree, Bruce. I've been to some layouts where, the sound is good for like 3 minutes. And then after that, please turn it off. It's irritating.
Up in the front of this train that's going by now, I have represented, it was a GP7B unit. EMD made a total, there's that white car.
Got it.
Yeah, it's a pump fitting on the other end.
Looks
EMD
nice.
made a total of 5 GP7B, or as Santa Fe called them, cabless units, and Santa Fe owned all 5.
Oh, look at that load. That's awesome.
That I found out, Steve Lasher gave me a little intelligence on that. That probably should have been running at the front of the train. That's a deck bridge girder that overhangs onto 2 idler flat cars.
Was that a one piece? I mean, I have a deck girder load, but it was actually a kit that I built.
It came from Sunshine Models, and it was built up of multiple pieces, including all the blocking and bracing and tie down.
And thanks to Bruce, I have one of those now too.
His was scratch built. Okay, here comes
at some point, if there was interest out there, I could probably do a gathering presentation on how the railroads handled dimensional shipments, or at least my experience with them.
Russell, you want to make a note of that and get Steve on the calendar, please?
Yeah. Hey, Steve, get on the
Yeah.
calendar.
I'll see you down the road. Hey, who did your Santa Fe cabooses, Bruce?
Let's see. I got to break them down. There's that white load again.
Yes. Got it.
Let's see. I have 8 of them. 5 of them were Intermountain Santa Fe caboose kits. 2 of them were from Sunshine Models. The Intermountains are curved roof or rounded roof. The Sunshine Models are peaked roof. It came to a peak at the top rather than curved or rounded. And one was from, it was a company under Intermountain, and they made ready-made ones. The red one you saw in the very first run by was one of theirs. The name of the company escapes me, but I think Intermountain built them for this company.
It'd be Centralia Car Shops.
That's
Yeah,
it.
it is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love
They did Illinois Central cabooses too. So I got a few of them.
That's one of the Intermountains there. It's got a curved roof. But they were kits, and I built them up and painted them. I think
Hey.
1 or 2 presentations ago, I showed you how I put the electric stuff in it for lighted marker lights on them. A couple of them.
Anybody modeling in the Louisville area should put a couple flat cars or loads of truck frames on those flat cars, because you see a bunch of them going in and out of KTP up there.
Very first run by I showed you had 2 flat cars with them.
Yep. Was that train headed east?
That particular one was on the westbound main.
Oh, okay. I'm gonna say if it's east, it's probably going to Kansas City up Clay Como,
Could be.
where they built the 150s.
Here
Okay,
comes-
this go ahead.
Mark. Here comes my San Francisco Chief.
Oh,
This particular video, it's pulled by my 4 Alco PA units, 2,000 horsepower units. I also have a lash up of 5 Athearn Genesis F series units that I pull the train with. And I don't know if you could read it in the beginning or if you remember from 1 or 2 presentations ago, this took me probably 15 years to create this train, getting the correct models of the specific cars, researching the order the cars were running in the particular area between Beelan and Clovis, New Mexico in the summer of '66. Even accurate to the placement of the cars in the train. I think here it comes by again. Yeah. The PA units are from Proto 2000, and they typically made A units powered and B units were unpowered, but I was able to acquire a couple of dummy B units and then a couple more A units and they had the same frame. So I took the A unit frame and drive system, proofed it out like Russ talked about, and then mounted the B unit shells to them. And part of the reason was this train is all brass.
ooh.
17.35 pounds. And it's going up that 1.3% grade now. You can see in the back end there, I've got a red light and a drumhead tail light on the San Francisco Chief too.
Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks, Barry. Maybe
Ron,
Stan,
thank you for hosting.
Stan had to split. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Bruce, so much for sharing your layout with us.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Hope to see everybody next week.
Yeah, don't forget. Thank you, Bob.
Alrighty. Bye
Thanks.
now.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank
All
you.
right,
Bye.
see y'all.